How might firms undertake business activities successfully in emerging markets? That's a question we'll try to answer in this segment of the talk. I've outlined a number of key points. I haven't tried to be exhaustive here, but to give you some indicators, indications as to how firms might do business successfully in these emerging markets. The first point, do your homework well, research thoroughly, and target appropriately. Second point, have a committed international outlook and demonstrate long-term commitment to emerging markets. It's also important, thirdly, to go with your A game. Big emerging markets tend to be competitive battlegrounds. So firms are advised to go with their A games. Then the next, build close, long-lasting relationships in these markets. These relationships are often critical, sometimes decisive in terms of the amount of success and performance you achieve in these markets. Next, respect, adapt to, and learn from emerging markets. Phrases such as cultural fluency, globalization approach, in other words, think global, act local. These are key concepts that are relevant in this context, and we'll talk about this. And then demonstrate good corporate citizenship. This is increasingly called for firms, both within their national markets, but also operating internationally, particularly in emerging markets. And lastly, firms are strongly advised to anticipate difficulties that are likely to arise and to proactively manage this properly. We'll now go on to talk about each and every one of these points, elaborate on them, and give some key pieces of advice. Do your homework thoroughly. Market research is something that is critical to the entire marketing discipline, but it becomes even more crucial as you expand internationally, including in emerging markets. So firms are advised to research thoroughly the macro environment, the political, economic, sociocultural, technological aspects of their host markets, of their target emerging markets. Gain good understanding, of course, knowledge is power. And on the basis of effective understanding of the key parameters in the target market, firms should be able to articulate appropriate strategy for the market. So undertaking appropriate strategic analysis, not just at the macro level, but also at the industry level, is called for in emerging markets. That might help companies identify the most attractive market opportunities, market niches, or key clusters, or what I would like to refer to as most vibrant centers in these emerging markets. For example, recent reports by McKinsey and Ernst & Young, Confederation of British Industries, their reports suggested that firms might actually gain by focusing on cities rather than countries. They feel that key cities, particularly in big growth markets that are undergoing significant urbanization, that identifying key cities, key conurbations, might be particularly crucial. So it is not really targeting countries, but targeting key cities. And that is a useful piece of advice, and that could only come about based on appropriate research and doing appropriate homework. Next, I'd like to talk a little bit about having a committed international outlook and long-term commitment. So these are very crucial. Companies that are seen to be internationally orientated, companies that are managed and led by top management that are friendly, that are pro-international markets, that have a consider the international market as a comfort zone as opposed to be something to be tolerated, those companies tend to do better in international markets, including emerging markets. And Ernst & Young, for example, suggested, again in a recent report, that companies that are entering high growth markets should do so with a clear long-term strategy. Strategy that helps them to recognize that there are bound to be costs in terms of time, human talent, risks, and so on and so forth. So if they have that clear realization, then they're more likely to support their international effort in emerging markets, in these high growth markets, appropriately. For example, by sending senior management regularly, visiting those markets, interacting with key actors, with maybe their partners, their agents, their suppliers, etc. So those regular visits will be a demonstration of that commitment, of loyalty to such markets, and that would tend to yield dividends in terms of good returns and profitability. It's also important that companies that are venturing into emerging markets go with their A game, go with their best possible set of capabilities, their firm-specific advantages. So deploy those capabilities, give it your best shot. If companies have got very strong brand identity, favorable brand identity, they should deploy those in those emerging markets. It could also be that your country of origin effects is favorable to your company, and if that exists, it's worth leveraging, is worth taking advantage of by associating your products with your company, which has a very favorable perception or country of origin perception in those key target markets. So favorable country of origin advantages could be leveraged and should be leveraged as often as possible. Part of going with your A game also relates to identifying very successful products, unique products that are within your portfolio. If possible, innovating around those products and adapting them to suit the tastes and preferences in target emerging markets. Using some of these strategies could be a very good way of starting and making a very positive, favorable impression. Relationships. Very critical in emerging markets, in international markets generally, in marketing in general. But particularly in international markets, these become very critical. In some cases, it will be an absolute waste of time trying to penetrate and succeed in key emerging markets without developing appropriate collaborative relationships. So relationships with agents, distributors, with government officials, even with competitors, maybe acquiring competitors or joint venturing with competitors, with the media and with other interest groups that are likely to impact upon the operations of your business in these markets. So it makes sense for companies to do their homework and then think about key target relationships that they need to develop and they need to sustain in key markets in order to improve their chances of being successful. Respect is a phrase that we are all familiar with. And in the context of our discussion, it makes absolute sense for companies to be respectful of their target emerging markets. Respect by trying to learn what ought to be learned about those markets and adapting to their key characteristics and peculiarities as necessary. That has been seen to be an important factor in achieving successful operations internationally. Companies are encouraged to become culturally fluent and to adopt a global perspective. In other words, being locally aware and being aware of local sensitivities and trying to go beyond explicit knowledge, but understanding what tacit knowledge and the tacit implications of some of their operations. So these are issues that companies ought to be aware of, and because they might be the difference between success and failure in international markets. A number of quotes I would like to make reference to. Price Waterhouse Coopers, Era Kalish did say that you have to be culturally sensitive in the selection of merchandise in order to succeed in every foreign market. And this consultant was talking in relation to the operations of Carrefour, the French retailer, and was highlighting the fact that Carrefour was particularly successful in key international markets because they did their homework and gained a very important cultural perspective, which they translated to their merchandise and product selection in their target emerging markets. Some other helpful tips that are worth giving is to say that it's important to take a flexible approach, tailor your business model to local business environment. That is an advice from Ernst & Young. Also, they did suggest that companies should seriously consider attracting high-quality employees with cultural awareness and those that have relevant language skills. That these are some of the factors that might enhance prospects of being successful in emerging markets. It's also important that companies seek out and appoint suitably qualified local managerial talents. So if there are locals with appropriate skills, with appropriate managerial talent, it makes absolute sense to identify those, to proactively seek out those and bring them on board because they'll become good advocates and ambassadors of the cause of the company. Demonstrating good corporate citizenship, as I mentioned earlier, is something that is important not just in the international marketing context, but also locally as well. But even so, in the international marketing context, in these emerging markets where the company is seeking to cultivate friends, to make friends, to retain favorable perceptions and coverage in the media, but also showing how good a corporate citizen that they are. Companies should be mindful of ways of supporting the environment, their employees, the larger community of which they are a part, and these are ways of actually enhancing their brand identity, improving the favorability factors, and actually winning favors from other stakeholders, including the government, local officials, and the media. So it makes sense for companies to be aware of the importance of corporate citizenship and related activities in emerging markets. The last slide relates to the importance of anticipating and managing challenges that are bound to arise when companies do business in emerging markets. As I mentioned earlier in this presentation, emerging markets are characterized by institutional voids, lack of maturity in terms of key institutions that facilitate the functioning of markets. So in absence of these voids, companies have to be especially careful, proactive in terms of anticipating problems, challenges that might arise, and working with appropriate officials to minimize the negative impact of those inadequacies on their operations. So typical challenges that they ought to be aware of would include the insecurity of intellectual property rights. They're not particularly secure. Government bureaucracy might be particularly challenging and difficult to navigate. Things like corruption, which tends to be more pervasive in emerging markets, might be part of the problem as far as government bureaucracy is concerned. So these are issues to anticipate and to try to manage. It's also the case that local talent may not be sufficient to manage operations in emerging markets. So companies have to think about expatriate policy, about human resource development, training, and so on and so forth. And these are issues that might critically impact upon performance and profitability in key markets. There are also issues about lack of information or reliable, adequate information required to make informed investment decisions or even assess the credit worthiness of customers. So, these are challenges, but companies could find creative ways of managing these challenges and thriving in emerging markets. Distribution system and distribution structure, infrastructure sometimes represents big challenges in emerging markets. In fact, typically that tends to happen. And again, companies ought to reflect upon these challenges and try and learn lessons from other companies that have expanded internationally, that are doing good business in these parts of the world, and learn from them how they manage to create alternative, sustainable distribution systems or infrastructure. I've mentioned corruption earlier, but is worth identifying it as a key challenge because, as I said, it tends to be pervasive and it tends to be a particularly concerning aspect of operating in international markets. Companies should, consistent with being a good corporate citizen, try to uphold the law and try to work with appropriate authorities to minimize and to avoid getting involved in activities that might negatively affect their global corporate identity. Now, it's been a pleasure talking with you, sharing some of these thoughts with you. Thanks, and I look forward to having another set of discussions with you in the future. Thanks, bye.